Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is Eisenherz and today I'm just sharing some thoughts I have about how Wizards could improve the playability of monocolor decks in cEDH and why I think that would be a good step to improve the overall diversity of the format. So let's start with the fundamental question. Are monocolor decks at a disadvantage compared to multicolor decks in cEDH? And if so, why are they at a disadvantage? If we look at the top 24 decks by conversion rate in the last 6 months on EDH top 16, we see that there are only 2 monocolor decks, already 5 2-color decks, a total of 10 3-color decks, only 4 4-color decks, and 3 5-color decks. This little breakdown shows that playing a deck with 2 to 4 colors gives you an edge over decks with only 1 or all 5 colors. But why? Well, monocolor decks are at an inherent disadvantage because the concept of color identity immensely limits the card pool you can choose from for your deck. The only upside you have from playing monocolor decks is that you mostly do not have to worry about color fixing unless you play a lot of lands and rocks that produce colorless mana. On the other side of the spectrum, there are 5-color decks that have access to the biggest card pool and thereby can play all the best cards, but they apparently don't automatically all have the highest conversion rates. That's probably because A, there aren't too many competitively viable 5-color commanders, and B, color fixing can become an issue if you need to produce all colors of mana for your game plan to function properly. So the sweet spot between card pool, viable commanders, and color fixing seems to be around 3 colors. This phenomenon does not translate to other formats such as Legacy. While playing more colors obviously gives you more card options, there is A, no need for a competitively viable commander, and B, mana fixing with Pain lands, Fetch lands, and Shock lands becomes a much bigger concern in a 20-life 1v1 format. In fact, a lot of monocolor decks perform very well in Legacy, like Mono Green Eldrazi, Mono Red Stompy, or even colorless Mystic Forge, because it's not a singleton format, color fixing can be harder, and life tools are much more relevant. So, in conclusion, we can say that opposed to other competitive formats, monocolor decks are at a disadvantage in cEDH because on one side they lack access to a lot of cards, and on the other side, mana fixing is mostly a non-issue in cEDH. If Wizards wants to push diversity and increase viability of monocolor decks in the competitive EDH meta, they would be able to do so by either A, increasing the power of monocolor decks, B, reworking the concept of color identity, or C, significantly nerfing color fixing. In my opinion, both options B and C can be dismissed. B would require significant rules changes that would drastically impact the way this format was designed, and C would mean more bans, which is something most people want to avoid, because again, having a large card pool is one of the key characteristics of EDH. This leaves us with option A, increasing the power of monocolored decks. But how could Wizards increase the power of monocolored decks without also increasing the power of 2, 3 and 4-color decks? Simply printing more good monocolored cards won't fix it. In fact, even most high-colored decks only play very few multicolored cards. The issue is not the lack of good cards, but the fact that they will immediately also be picked up by multicolored decks. Take Esper Sentinel for example. It's a mono-white card, but it doesn't make mono-white more viable compared to multicolored decks, because it can easily be played in any white deck. So what we actually need are good monocolored cards that can only be played in monocolored decks, or at least have mechanics that make multicolored decks not want to run them or profit off of them as much. And oh well, Wizards already tried this a few times, with varying degrees of success. In September of 2020, Zendika Rising gave us the first modal dual-faced lands, which were monocolored spells on the front side and either tapped lands or bolt lands on the backside. These cards actually had an impact in the competitive meta. Not only are most of them basically free includes for monocolored decks, but they also increase the overall spell density and give monocolored decks more gameplay options. Though none of these MDFCs is inherently a busted card, they are still so useful that you could slot them instead of a basic land. Whereas multicolor decks can't just jam them into their decks as well, because they aren't inherently busted and produce only one kind of mana, making color fixing harder. Overall, these MDFCs were a great mechanic to impact the power gap between mono and multicolored decks. Later that same year, Commander Legends gave us a few cards that were better if your commander had fewer colors, such as War Room and Commander's Plate. But honestly, none of these can be considered good enough to impact the power gap between mono and multicolored decks. This year, Wizards revisited the concept of MDFCs by printing more playable bold lands for monocolored decks and also printing two-colored MDFCs, whose land side can produce two types of mana but also enters tapped. Again, some of these cards see play in monocolored decks, whereas the two-colored MDFCs see virtually no play in multicolored decks because they enter tapped. As mentioned before, these MDFCs were and still are a solid step to fix the power gap between mono and multicolored decks. However, some monocolored MDFCs are so good that they actually see play in multicolored decks such as Sink into Stupor, Aghadim's Awakening or Shatterskull's Smashing. This tells us that Wizards could push this approach even further. They could implement mechanics and print cards that specifically only work in monocolored decks, and this leads me to a few ideas I recently had. In 2020, Wizards released Ikoria Layers of Behemoth, a set that infamously featured the Companion mechanic. Companions are cards that can only be added to your deck if your deck meets certain criteria, like each of your permanent having an activated ability, or costing 2 or less mana, or none of your cards having 2 of the same pips. So the concept of only allowing a card in a deck if a certain criteria is met is not new to MTG at all. However, the Companion mechanic proved to be so broken that the whole mechanic had to be errated. Lutri was preemptively banned from EDH, and other companions had to be banned in different formats, like Lurrus or Yorion in Legacy. So my idea was to take the concepts of MDFCs and companions and come up with something that only works if your deck meets the criteria of being monocolored, but is also not so strong that it breaks the format. You could call these cards signature spells like in Oathbreaker, or just companion spells. These companion spells would work something like this. Every color gets 3 to 5 new cards of different types that can be played in the 99 just like any other card. These cards should all do something that represents the basic mechanics of the color pie, like a counterspell for blue or a removal spell for black. However, all of these cards should be worse versions of existing cEDH staples by being more expensive or having another form of restriction. This way, these cards don't just become auto-includes in the 99 of multicolored decks. But of course, if these cards are worse than existing options, they need to have some kind of upside to be playable in monocolored decks. So to make these color pie characteristic cards playable for monocolored decks, but not for multicolored decks, they all get an additional mechanic that functions somewhat similar to the current companion rule. You choose one of those spells as a companion spell before the game, announce it without revealing it, and place it outside of the game. Then, once a game, you can pay X mana as a special action to put it into your hand at instant speed. The biggest difference being that you do not have to reveal your companion spell before the game, because that would make you more vulnerable to priority pressuring, because your opponents would know that you have a counterspell or something similar at your disposal. So here's an example of what a card like this could look like. This one is just a blue 3 mana counterspell that wouldn't see play in any cEDH deck, because it is just a weaker counterspell. But if we add the companion spell mechanic, we immediately make it more playable by giving mono blue decks more gameplay options. It's not something you'd play in your 99, and also not something that would be slotted in multicolored decks, but as a companion spell, you get access to one more card from the beginning of the game, ever so slightly pushing the viability of monocolored decks by increasing their gameplay options without printing absurdly strong cards with 3 or more pips of a single color. If this companion spell mechanic is too complicated for you and for Wizards, there is also the option to print free spells that are only free if your commanders have only one color in their color identity. This card design ties in pretty neatly to the cycles of free spells we get in every Modern Horizons set and the Fierce Guardianship cycle. This approach is definitely more straightforward and easy to understand, but I think it's also more risky from a power level perspective and also allows for less card design options overall. Just imagine a card like Fierce Guardianship or Deflecting Spot, but instead of saying, if you control a commander, you may cast a spell without paying its mana cost, it says, if your commanders have only one color in their color identity, you may cast the spell without paying its mana cost. A 3 mana negate is unplayable in cEDH, but a 3 mana negate that's free if you control a commander is really strong. And so is a 3 mana negate that's free if your commanders have only one color in their color identity. So what do you think about these ideas? Do you think they can give monocolor decks the cards and gameplay options they need in order to be more competitive? Or do you have any ideas of your own? As always, thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, comment and subscribe. This is Eisenherz and auf Wiedersehen.